Being queen means you can get away with a lot of weird behavior. These outlandish acts may have worked for these royals and other iconic figures, but you try to do the same and see what happens.
More than 1,500 years before the reign of Elizabeth I of England, Cleopatra proved that women were capable of ruling nations, and that they could do it with intelligence, grace, and sometimes brutality. But much of what we know about the Queen of the Nile comes from history that has been fictionalized, refictionalized, and then fictionalized some more. So much that the made-up stuff is sometimes better known than the facts, and the facts themselves are kinda surprising.
Weak am I? She knows how to beat her slaves well enough, but she cannot throw away that pipe. And she knows it.
If someone asked you to name an Egyptian from ancient history, it would probably be a toss-up between King Tut and Cleopatra. For many people, these are the two historical figures that embody ancient Egypt. Gilded, eyelinered, and walking around their luxurious palaces with their hands at 90-degree angles like in that Bangles song from the 80s. But here's the funny thing. One of those two people was not actually Egyptian.
You gotta be f***ing kidding.
We're not. According to the history of Macedonia, Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was descended from Alexander the Great's general, a man named Ptolemy of Lagos. That means they not only had Greek ancestry, they spoke Greek and followed Greek customs too. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for 300 years after the nation was handed over to Ptolemy following Alexander's passing in 323 BC. So how did Egypt wind up in the hands of a bunch of helmet-wearing dudes from another continent? They conquered it, which is what the ancient Greeks often did whenever they got bored. Inbreeding, as it turns out, is not just for nasty Lannister queens and Deliverance characters. It was practiced to some degree in pretty much every royal family from Europe to the Middle East. But the Egyptians practically turned it into a competitive sport. In Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris married his sister Isis in order to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline. They were gods, so presumably genetic disorders weren't really a problem for them. Unfortunately for the Egyptian pharaohs, who saw the Egyptian gods as awesome role models, genetic disorders were a problem for mortals. Anyway, when the Ptolemies rose to power, they were all, hey, this inbreeding thing sounds like a great idea. So by the time that got down to Cleopatra a few hundred years later, she was a genetic soup of mish-mashed Ptolemies. In keeping with their very gross, noble family tradition, Cleopatra went on to marry both of her younger brothers. Pretty much every modern and semi-modern depiction of Cleopatra tells us she was stunningly beautiful, which frankly does seem sort of incompatible with the whole generations of incest thing, but maybe it was a fluke. In February 2007, a coin was unearthed bearing a portrait of Cleopatra, which appears to confirm that the queen was actually rather ordinary looking. The fact that ancient historians didn't say much about her looks also suggests she was no Elizabeth Taylor, but the more important point is that it really doesn't matter. Life of Antony, written by Plutarch in 75 AD, made the following observation about Cleopatra. Her actual beauty was not so remarkable that none could be compared with her, or that no one could see her without being struck by it, but the contact of her presence was irresistible. The character that attended all she said or did was something bewitching. Turns out, Cleopatra wasn't just a shrewd and charming diplomat, she was also a student of mathematics, medicine, alchemy, economics, history, geography, and pretty much every general education subject you probably detested in college. Oh, and she spoke 9 languages, so feel free to bring that up to your snobby hipster friend next time they try to order from your favorite sushi spot in Japanese. In Egypt, it was customary for pharaohs to rule in pairs. Every regent needed a co-regent of the opposite gender. According to Live Science, Cleopatra ruled with her father Ptolemy XII for a short time until his demise in 51 BC. In his will, Ptolemy XII decreed that Cleopatra should marry her 11-year-old brother, which was probably only a ceremonial thing. Either way, the two were clearly not fond of each other, and the relationship ended with Ptolemy XIII trying to wrest control of the throne, and his sister appealing to Julius Caesar for help reining him in.
If you ally with my sister, I will kill every last Roman in Alexandria.
Enough of the big words, little brother.
Caesar and Cleopatra famously became lovers, and Ptolemy XIII was never happy with Caesar's decision that he should rule with his sister. Eventually, Caesar defeated Ptolemy at the Battle of the Nile, and Ptolemy drowned in the river while trying to escape, so Cleopatra was really only partially responsible for sending her brother to a watery grave.
But wait! There's more!
Because of the whole must-have-a co-regent thing, Cleopatra had to marry her other brother, who later died under mysterious circumstances. In other words, Cleopatra had him poisoned. Then she ordered the execution of her sister Arsinoe. who took Ptolemy's side during the family feud and at one point declared herself queen. In conclusion, Game of Thrones is plagiarized from Cleopatra's diary. We've already established that Cleopatra was interested in alchemy, but she also understood a bit of actual chemistry. She believed in the power of fragrance not just as a cosmetic, but also as a tool of persuasion. According to Perfume Power, Cleopatra doused her ship's sails with perfume before sailing to her first rendezvous with Mark Antony to make sure that he smelled her before he saw her. She also owned a perfume factory, which sort of seems like an odd side job for a queen, but if you just can't find the sort of mind control fragrances you need at the Macy's perfume counter, there's probably some value in just having it done at your own factory. The ruins of Cleopatra's perfume factory are located near the Dead Sea, and there's evidence that it also operated as a sort of day spa. Some seating remains, which is reminiscent of the chairs you might sit in to have your nails done, or if you, too, wanted to be doused with mind control fragrances. Many ancient rulers saw themselves as divine, even godlike. For Cleopatra, the whole ruler as divine thing was part ego, part public relations genius.
I am God.
According to scholar Elizabeth A. McCabe, Cleopatra called herself the new Isis, telling her subjects she was the embodiment of Isis on Earth, or the reincarnation of the goddess. Not to be left out, Mark Antony also claimed to be the embodiment of Osiris on Earth. Remember the whole Isis marries her brother Osiris thing? There you go. Now, that's not to say that Cleopatra was very dedicated to the whole Isis thing. Prior to that, she was known to play whichever goddess happened to suit her. When she sailed to that first meeting with Mark Antony on her perfumed barge, she was dressed as the goddess Venus and was waited on by young boys dressed as cupids and maids dressed as sea nymphs. Antony was enamored, to say the least, because who doesn't get all hot and bothered when their crush shows up for a first date on a perfumed barge dressed as a deity? One of Cleopatra's most enduring legends has not to do with her life, but her untimely passing. According to the story, when Cleopatra learned her forces had been defeated by Octavian Augustus, who would become the first emperor of Rome, she killed herself by holding a venomous snake to her breast. Because historians like to debate things, no one really definitively accepts this account of Cleopatra's death. For a start, the story indicates that it took only a few minutes for her to die, but the venom of that particular kind of Egyptian snake actually takes a few hours to work, and is even occasionally survivable. According to the Smithsonian, most historians do agree Cleopatra's death was self-inflicted, but the method isn't clear. It's possible she simply drank a bunch of poison, but that story just isn't as dramatic, which is probably why today most people still think it was a snake. Like pretty much every human being, Cleopatra had an innate desire to avoid getting older.
Lines, wrinkles, and those little sunken places? Not anymore.
Unfortunately, plastic surgeons were in short supply in 1st century BC Egypt, and Botox wouldn't be invented for another couple millennia, so Cleopatra had to get creative. According to legend, Cleopatra's daily bath required a tub and 700 lactating donkeys. You heard that right. According to the Vintage News, all over the ancient world, women used donkey milk to keep their skin pale and to keep wrinkles at bay. Emperor Nero's wife was said to travel with whole troops of she-asses so she'd never have to miss her daily donkey milk bath. And today, scientists know donkey milk has a lot of important health benefits. It can be used as a cow milk substitute for people with allergies, and yes, it's also used in modern beauty products, just in case you don't think you'll be able to procure yourself 700 donkeys and enough servants to milk them every day. Throughout much of ancient history, women with cheating husbands were just expected to smile happily and pretend like they weren't feeling totally humiliated. So imagine what Julius Caesar's wife Calpurnia must have thought when her husband erected a gilded statue of Cleopatra in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, right next to the statue of the goddess herself. This was obnoxious on a number of levels, not just because Caesar seemed completely indifferent to how a very public statue of his mistress would make his wife feel, but also because the Romans didn't believe their rulers were particularly divine the way the Egyptians did. However scandalized the Roman people were by the statue, it remained in the temple for at least 200 years, so it's possible the statue had at least some religious significance, probably because of Cleopatra's association with the goddess Isis, who had her own minor cult following in Rome. Mark Antony might not have his priorities in check. Why? Well, he skipped an entire invasion so he could spend the winter with Cleopatra in her Alexandrian palace. That's why. According to HistoryNet, in 41 BC, Antony assembled an army and went east, summoning client kings in hopes of gathering resources for a Parthian invasion. One of those client kings was 28-year-old Cleopatra, who said something to the effect of, "Let's make love, not war." And then Antony said something to the effect of, "The invasion can wait," and followed her back to Alexandria, leaving his army in the hands of his governor. To make a long story short, the Parthians soon crossed the Euphrates River, and everything, pardon our French, went to hell. Meanwhile, Antony's wife Fulvia had to flee Rome after getting her butt kicked by Julius Caesar's heir Octavian. It's hard to say which is worse, being attacked by your husband's political rival while he's off cheating on you with his Egyptian queen mistress, or keeping your mouth shut while your husband erects a gilded statue of his Egyptian queen mistress. If Fulvia and Calpurnia had formed a scorned wives club, Roman history would have been a great CW series.
The First Lady has a complex job. She isn't paid and doesn't even really have an official position, but she always has to look perfect, represent her country well, and champion her own causes. Some of them found ways of being themselves in a manner that was a little un-First Lady-like, and some of them were just plain weird. Here's what you might not know about the former First Ladies of America. James Madison's wife, Dolly, would prove to be one of the 1800s' biggest party animals, and while it might seem silly now, throwing huge shindigs like she did was a little taboo at the time. Every week, she hosted her so-called Wednesday night squeezes and invited everyone from politicians to celebrities to shoemakers off the street.
Dolly wanted to include a true cross-section of her countrymen.
By the end of the day, it was like, the more the merrier.
On top of that, she also tended to dress a little provocatively at her soirees. Dolly Madison might not have been the first society woman to live in the White House, but she was perhaps the busiest. Of all the First Ladies, Mary Todd Lincoln is perhaps the most famous for being odd. After losing 2 of her children, she turned to spiritualism, as she was sure that their ghosts showed up at the end of her bed every night and were trying to contact her. Her seances were led by a variety of mediums and took place at the White House, and President Lincoln attended at least one of them. Amazingly, if Lincoln had listened to the warnings of one medium, he might have escaped his fate. Ordinarily, telling a president people are out to get him might be worth a shrug, but Charles Colchester had more reason to know the truth than most people. He just so happened to be drinking buddies with John Wilkes Booth, who wasn't shy when it came to talking about his desire to harm Abe. Forget ethereal spirits, it was the sharing of earthly spirits that might have saved him. After her husband's untimely passing, Mary Todd became even more into her rituals, attending a spiritualist commune for a few days. She eventually visited a famous ghost photographer who superimposed an image of her late husband behind her, but made it look like his spirit was lingering around her, just as she would want. When it came to the occult, Florence Harding was all in as well. She grew up surrounded by people who put hexes on their barns to ward off evil spirits. So when she got to the White House, she hired a clairvoyant to sniff out anyone in the administration who was out to get her husband.
In addition to her belief in mediums, she also bought into homeopathy.
When she had a kidney issue, she was so impressed with her treatment that she had her husband bring her doctor to Washington and appoint him as the official presidential physician. This would prove fatal, however, when that medic misdiagnosed President Warren G. Harding's heart attack as mere food poisoning, and the flub cost him his life.
You idiot!
Betty Ford might have become First Lady suddenly due to the resignation of Richard Nixon, but she wasn't going to let her new role cramp her style. She was a true child of the 1970s, no matter what her real age, and she indulged in many of the fads. This involved wearing a mood ring and dancing around the halls of the White House. She even spoke in radically modern terms about people using marijuana and having premarital relations, and she wasn't shy when it came to talking about her progressive political positions. But her biggest cliche 70s thing was using a CB radio. In 1976, the First Lady was dealing with chronic arthritis and couldn't join her husband on the campaign trail, so she got her own license and campaigned for him through the CB. Her handle was Big Mama. Of course, despite her quirks, Ford is perhaps best known for her very candid experience battling addiction, which led to the foundation of the Betty Ford Center and made her name forever associated with alcohol recovery efforts. Nancy Reagan came from Hollywood, so it is not too surprising she brought some strange habits to Washington. But instead of following fad diets or signing on to ad campaigns, she picked up astrology, and she picked it up hard. What had been a mere pastime became an absolute obsession after Ronald Reagan was shot.
From then on, she had her astrologer plan virtually every event in the president's life in order to keep him safe, even though she only ever met her once.
I timed most of the speeches. I timed when he would take Air Force One, when he would take off, and when he would land.
Nancy tried to hide her reliance on the controversial calendar maker by paying through a third party, but the public still found out, and she was mercilessly mocked for the rest of her life.
Hey, I didn't want to get into a Nancy Reagan thing about, doing any seances.
Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson were engaged just 10 weeks after meeting, but even that wait was almost too much for Lyndon, who had proposed to her during their first date. Their honeymoon in Mexico involved so much physical intimacy that when Lady Bird got back to the States, the first thing she did was see a gynecologist. Normally a routine examination before marriage, she neglected to make the appointment in the rush to the altar. But given her husband's notorious appetite for women, the exam more or less made sure that she could even handle the future president's constant advances. But no doctor could help her with her husband's wandering eye. According to Texas Monthly, Lyndon liked women, and he didn't care if his wife was around while he liked them. However, his political career meant he couldn't afford to divorce her, and she knew it. But that didn't stop Lady Bird from modeling herself on a woman her husband had a decades-long affair with. She copied her clothes, makeup, and jewelry, all in the hopes her husband would stay interested and stop sleeping around. The weirdest thing about Pat Nixon is that she was married to Richard Nixon. He was a rude, standoffish individual, whereas everyone seemed to think Pat was the greatest woman who had ever lived. As soon as she arrived on the world stage when her husband became vice president in 1953, organizations threw awards at her for just being the best. According to Parade, Pat was named Outstanding Homemaker of the Year in 1953, Mother of the Year in 1955, and the nation's ideal wife by the Homemakers Forum in 1957. Pat was so popular that when Richard ran for president in 1960, his campaign pushed the slogan "Pat for First Lady" and put it on everything from buttons to bumper stickers. She was also in the top 10 of Gallup's yearly poll of most admired men and women in the world 14 times, including the 4 years immediately after her husband resigned in disgrace. Eleanor Roosevelt is famous for a lot of things, but during her lifetime she was controversial, not just for her actions or political views, but also because she basically became a supermodel. It might sound crazy, but according to the Washington Post, advertisers were climbing over each other to sign her as a model for their brands. Roosevelt advertised everything from hot dog buns to mattresses. Congress was none too pleased when they realized what the First Lady was getting up to in her free time. They even went so far as to launch an inquiry. But Eleanor shut it down when she revealed that almost all the money she made from her pitchwoman career went to charity. That made it a little hard to be mad at her, and the inquiry was dropped. Jackie Kennedy was the perfect First Lady. She was poised and beautiful and comfortable around power. According to the book Jackie, Janet, and Lee, she was raised this way from the beginning. She and her sister Lee learned from their mother to be thin and pleasing to men, rich men in particular. So Jackie married a future president, while Lee married a Polish prince. But there were serious rivalries between the two women. Writer Gore Vidal swears Lee slept with John F. Kennedy repeatedly while he was married to Jackie, and that the First Lady knew about it but was too proper to make a fuss. After John's death, Jackie let a respectable amount of time pass before marrying Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis. There was just one problem. Onassis had been Lee's boyfriend for 6 years. Lee had introduced the two, and they went behind her back and made a marriage of convenience for both of them. Then Jackie didn't even bother telling Lee what was happening. Instead, it was Onassis who called his girlfriend, told her he'd decided to marry her sister, and said he'd love it if she came to the wedding. Lee did come, but the sisters' relationship was completely destroyed. And Jackie stuck the knife in again at the end, leaving nothing to Lee in her will. Julia Tyler wasn't John Tyler's First Lady, but when her predecessor died and she married into the job, she decided she was going to use it to make herself famous. According to the National First Ladies Library, shortly after her marriage, Julia commissioned a flattering etching of herself wearing expensive jewels and a fancy dress. She then had it mass-produced and available for sale so anyone could have the joy of looking at her. Tyler was the first known First Lady to try and get her name in the papers on her own merit. She befriended reporters and made sure there were constant descriptions of events she went to. There's even some evidence that she may have handed out these press releases rather than just waiting and hoping a reporter would cover her. Sometimes when you live your life cooped up in a palace, you start to believe that you swallowed an entire musical instrument. Some of these royals had mental struggles, while others were just bucking societal norms, but all of them exhibited rather strange behavior. If she lived today, Princess Isabella of Parma would be just another liberated woman, but things were a little bit different in the 1700s. The limited marriage market for royals often led to disasters, but Crown Prince Joseph of Austria struck gold when he fell head over heels for his young wife. Alas, Isabella was less interested in him, and it may have been because she was a lesbian. According to the book A Treasury of Royal Scandals, she became obsessed with her husband's sister, Christina. She sent her letters that said things like, "I am told that the day begins with God. I, however, begin the day by thinking of the object of my love, for I think of her incessantly." Isabella was also unusually well educated for the time, and she was openly hostile to the idea that she existed just to have kids. Nevertheless, she was pregnant quite often. This reportedly made her depressed and obsessed with the belief that she was going to die. She did, of smallpox at the age of 21. There are plenty of reasons to feel bad for Marie Louise, granddaughter of France's King Louis XIV. Starts, her mother basically ignored her from the moment she was born. She was married off at 14 and got pregnant 5 times over the course of 10 years, with all of those babies dying. Marie also reportedly had a disturbingly close relationship with her father, Prince Philippe II of Orléans. It started when she was 6 and had a life-threatening illness. After she recovered, she and Philippe were inseparable. He visited her for hours every day during her first pregnancy, and rumors spread that they had an incestuous relationship. It probably didn't help matters when he painted her in the nude. Furthermore, the princess was reportedly a raging alcoholic. Her other vice was gambling, and she lost obscene amounts of money in single games. She would also throw scandalous dinners and invite her priest so that he could see everything she was doing so that she wouldn't have to go to the trouble of confessing to him.
It seemed to be a good idea at the time.
Germans don't exactly have a reputation for being spontaneously passionate in the bedroom, but there are often exceptions to any stereotype. And if police files uncovered and the Prussian secret state archives are to be believed, the German royal family got up to some freaky stuff in the late 1800s. Princess Charlotte was the older sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II, so she was very well connected. In 1891, she invited a group of aristocrats, the Kaiser's brother-in-law, and a member of the government to a secluded hunting lodge. They drank, danced, and participated in a series of orgies. Afterwards, someone sent the attendees blackmail letters that included descriptions of their behavior along with helpful illustrations. Historians believe that the scandal-loving Charlotte sent the threats and that she might have invited the people in the first place just to entrap them. The controversy resulted in one person being arrested and another being killed in a duel. Meanwhile, Charlotte got off scot-free. As of 2024, Princess Sri Rasmi of Thailand is still alive, but she's never going to become queen, as her ex-husband, Maha Vajiralongkorn, divorced her before he ascended to the throne. But that fate couldn't have been too much of a surprise to her, considering that she was his third wife.
Her family is under a cloud of scandal and corruption allegations.
Before they broke up, they lived an interesting life together. This was perhaps best illustrated by their relationship with their poodle, Fufu, whom they seemed to be weirdly obsessed with. Opponents of the then prince released a video of a bizarre party that they threw in 2001. Sri Rasmi was completely naked except for a G-string, while plenty of courtiers watched. She even got down on the floor and ate cake next to the dog. The video caused a sensation, but not in Thailand itself, where there are strict laws prohibiting saying anything bad about the monarchy. Sri Rasmi didn't get custody of Fufu in the divorce, though the dog's weird journey was far from over. He was made an Air Chief Marshal, and after he died, his funeral lasted 4 days. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was the niece of the King of Poland, and she was also reportedly one of the most notorious sadists of all time. When she was young, her uncle taught her about Satanism, while an aunt instructed her in the pleasurable side of pain. By the time she was 15 and married off to a Hungarian nobleman, her dark personality was already well established. She asked her new husband to build her a torture chamber to her exacting specifications. He delivered. The Countess then proceeded to torture her servant girls. She stabbed pins under their fingernails, or she'd tie them down, covered them with honey, and left them to be attacked by insects. Eventually, she moved on to abducting peasants and then even the daughters of nobles. Elizabeth believed that human blood would keep her young and healthy, and she would do things like bite off chunks of the poor girl's flesh. Her connections protected her for a long time, but eventually she was tried for 80 counts of murder. She was ultimately convicted and locked in a windowless room where she died 3 years later. Princess Alexandria Amalia's Bavarian family was well known for their mental struggles. Her father was famously eccentric and liked to write poetry about the most bizarrely trivial things. Meanwhile, her nephew Ludwig II was obsessed with building castles to the point that he basically bankrupted the country. As for Alexandria, when she was young, she was reportedly obsessed with cleanliness. She would only wear white so that she could see any dirt that got on her. Then, one day, when she was 23, she was walking around her family's palace on tiptoes and moving sideways through doorways while avoiding touching anything. She then told her family that she just discovered that as a child she'd managed to swallow a full-size grand piano made of glass. She also believed that it was still inside her, so she needed to be careful that it didn't break. Weirdly enough, Alexandria wasn't the only noble in history who thought they were made of glass. It was such a popular delusion that it appeared in medical books and plays. Contemporary psychologists think it might have been a way for powerful people to express how they felt fragile in their important roles.
People love the story of a Jewish peasant girl rising to the rank of queen and eventually saving her entire people. But Queen Esther's story is more than that. Here are some weird things you didn't know about Queen Esther. Here's a brief and unofficial summation of Esther's story to get us started. Long ago in Persia, the queen angered the king, so he dumped her and picked a new queen, Esther, who was secretly Jewish. But when her cousin Mordecai got in trouble, the big bad guy Haman decided to kill all the Jewish people. So Esther threw a banquet and revealed to the king that she herself was Jewish. He took her aside, Haman ended up dead, and now to celebrate, we get Purim and triangle-shaped cookies. The end. But actually, there's a lot more to it than that. Weirdly, for a book about a woman, you have to start with the dude, Esther's husband, King Xerxes, after his conquering and soldiering days are over. First, let us clarify. Yes, it is the same King Xerxes from 300. He was the guy who tried to conquer Greece and failed, but his list of victories is pretty extensive. He basically created the very concept of Persia after he became the ruler of Babylonia, Egypt, and a bunch of other nations with their cultures. He also popularized Zoroastrianism, a religion which is considered the predecessor to a lot of monotheistic faiths that have messiah figures and contend with the balance between good and evil. Esther's predecessor, Queen Vashti, was a queen because she disobeyed King Xerxes, but the context puts things in perspective. King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to come to his feast. He wanted her to parade around so he could show off what a beautiful woman his wife was to his bros. This command came while she was hosting her own dinner, and some scholars think he was actually asking her to show up nude. She refused to come, probably because she didn't want to indulge her drunken husband, so obviously the king said she deserved to be punished for such a transgression. Though Vashti was once vilified, modern biblical scholars view her as a feminist icon, standing up for her own right and status as a person. Queen Esther's birth name was Hadassah, a Hebrew name that means myrtle, a beautiful type of tree, but she took on the name Esther to help hide her heritage. This was probably for her own protection, seeing as the anti-Semitic Haman was in power and her cousin Mordecai could see the way the wind was blowing. Esther's greatly admired by how much she tried to maintain her Jewish traditions even in secret. Esther and Mordecai were definitely cousins. There was also a big age gap between them, seeing as Mordecai took Esther in after she was orphaned. But according to the Torah.com, some translations suggest he took her in as his wife, not as his ward. It may not have been as icky as it sounds to modern ears though. Some scholars suggest Mordecai could have married Esther to protect her. The society at hand largely viewed women as the property of men, so marriage meant men wouldn't mess with Esther because to do so was to offend Mordecai. Esther wasn't just the king's wife, she was a political powerhouse in her own right. To save her people, she began with a risky first move, entering the king's court without being summoned. This could have 100% gotten Esther killed, but she dared to do it, dressed in the finery of a queen and accompanied by 2 maids to give her the proper air of authority and power. She then requested the king and Haman both attend a banquet, where she then dramatically revealed her heritage as well as Haman's plot to exterminate the Jews and begs for the king's help. It was a masterful bit of political theatre, but it was only part of the plan. In the background, Mordecai had also foiled a plot to kill the king. Once the king put two and two together, it culminated in a very bad day for Haman. The Jews were saved, Mordecai became the king's chief advisor, and Haman was executed. The Megillah, which is the Jewish text about Esther's life that's read at Purim, says that she may not have had natural beauty, but instead was blessed with grace from God. And honestly, Esther's story makes more sense when her beauty is a God-given superpower. The Jewish Encyclopedia states that in this version of events, the other girls, instead of being jealous, take care of her because they can clearly see the king will choose her. The king tries to look away from her when she visits court to resist her beauty, but God allegedly sends angels to force him to check her out. Later on, he says he will give Esther half the kingdom if she so asked. And when Haman is begging Queen Esther for his life, he falls onto the couch she's lying on. The king walks in, thinks Haman is trying to go after his hot wife, and promptly has Haman executed. For millennia, Esther's story has been celebrated during the holiday of Purim, but modern scholars believe that Purim might not originally have been a Jewish holiday at all. The theory that Purim and the story of Esther are a reworking of a Babylonian holiday, something suggested by the names. Esther, Mordecai, and Haman are close to the names of the Babylonian gods Ishtar, Marduk, and Haman. The holiday also didn't include religious elements initially. The reading of Esther's story in temple was added over time, and some Jews maintained the tradition of dressing up Halloween style on Purim, which may pay tribute to Jews secretly practicing their religion in times of persecution. It may have also been a way to lend dignity to poor people who were looking for help on Purim. When everyone receives gifts, no one's embarrassed. Esther's story is infamous among Bible scholars for never directly mentioning God. A lot of Sunday school pastors write this off, saying God doesn't have to be mentioned for evidence to show religious forces are at work in Esther's life. But the lack of mentioning of God was actually a big problem when it came to getting Esther into the Bible at all. Religious icon Martin Luther actually said about it, "I am so great an enemy to Esther that I wish it had not come to us at all, for it has too many heathen unnaturalities." Interestingly, though, the Greek version of the book of Esther does include dozens of references to God, but those parts are considered to be apocryphal, so they're not included in the Bible. Weird, right?
Running brothels, LARPing as the poor, and keeping old corpses away from the ladies. Plenty of women throughout history were considered bizarre, but when you're a queen, you can let your freak flag fly free. According to The Guardian, you could call Elizabeth II's grandmother, Queen Mary, a kleptomaniac. She would go to people's homes and straight up steal stuff. Royal Babylon says her technique went something like this. She'd pop by her house and see something she'd like. Instead of making conversation like a normal person who'd come to visit, she'd just stare at whatever object she wanted for a long time. This was the first warning sign. If you didn't get the point, she'd sigh and loudly say something like, "I'm caressing it with my eyes."
Precious.
If she was the queen, you'd probably give in and offer whatever it was to her as a present. But what if it was a family heirloom or something else you couldn't bear to part with? Then she'd just have to take it without you noticing. When people realized what she was doing, they took to hiding anything they thought she might take a shine to before she came over. She countered by showing up unannounced. The antique dealers of England had it bad as well. Queen Mary was known to stop by, take whatever she wanted, then forget to pay for it. Eventually, her stealing got so bad her assistants were on high alert, and if they found out later she'd managed to sneak something into her purse, it was returned with a note that there had been a misunderstanding. Empress Elizabeth ruled Russia on her own right and was the aunt-in-law of Catherine the Great. Someone with absolute power can do anything she wants, and what Elizabeth wanted was for her court to cross-dress. The issue was that Elizabeth thought she had fabulous legs, but the style of the day, big hoop skirts for women, meant she couldn't show them off. Men's clothes, on the other hand, had breeches and tights that exhibited their form. Since she was in charge and didn't want to be the only one who looked different, Elizabeth would throw huge balls where everyone had to cross-dress, or else. According to St. Petersburg and the Russian court, 1703 to 1761, the young Catherine actually enjoyed these parties, but she and the Empress may have been the only ones. Men's clothing wasn't flattering on all women, but it was the men who really had it bad. To go from the form-fitting clothing they usually wore to giant hoop skirts meant they had no idea how to maneuver their huge bulk while walking, let alone dancing. They were also expected to wear women's hairstyles, which meant enormous wigs. With a change so drastic, accidents were bound to happen, like when Catherine was knocked over while dancing and fell under a man's hoop skirt. Perhaps not surprisingly, the cross-dressing balls ended when Elizabeth died. Queen Nzinga of present-day Angola had a lot on her mind. She was busy fighting the Portuguese for most of her rule, managing to hold them off for 40 years. During this time, she also had needs, so she pulled together a harem of hot guys. In an odd twist, she made them dress like women, but maybe it made sense since she was strutting around looking like a man. But Nzinga didn't have time to go to her harem and decide who to sleep with each night. So according to Harvard's library collection, she devised a workaround. Every night, 2 dudes would fight to the death, and the queen would bed the winner. Then the next day, she'd execute him. At 75 years old, she decided she wasn't cut out for this anymore and disbanded her harem. But that doesn't mean she ditched everyone. From Eve to Dawn, A History of Women in the World says that she married one of her youngest wives, which makes her a serious cougar and a queen to be reckoned with. Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom was completely obsessed with death, and lots of important people in her life died when she was in charge, including her mom, her daughter, and most famously her husband, Prince Albert.
Will you marry me?
After he died, she declared the longest period of mourning in memory, and this is back when a random uncle dying meant you had to wear black for at least a year. Victoria never fully recovered from her grief and wore widow's weeds for 40 years until her death in 1901. And that's not all. Victoria also regularly took cocaine and opium, according to Beardy History, but those were legally available at the time. You can't compare today's illegal drug use to what used to be basically prescription medication. But Queen Victoria did dabble in some more controversial stuff, namely chloroform. Contrary to popular perception, the Queen liked sex a lot. This meant she was pretty much constantly pregnant while her husband was alive.
And also, when she does get pregnant, she's really scared.
During the birth of her 7th child, she was given chloroform and loved it so much she requested it at the births of her next 2 children. Chloroform was such a controversial drug at the time that when word leaked that the Queen indulged, the population was shocked. The famous medical journal The Lancet insisted the rumors couldn't be true, but they absolutely were. Catherine the Great was one of the most famous women ever to rule a country. She governed Russia with an iron fist and did a pretty good job of it. Today, she's well known for her crazy libido, but the most famous story about her is an urban legend. She wasn't killed doing it with a horse, but she did like doing it with guys. Lots of them. She wasn't as prolific as some kings, though. When she fancied someone, she stuck with him for a while before moving on to the next conquest.
We women are too much creatures of the heart, aren't we, Catherine?
Yes, Your Majesty.
However, when you're busy running one of the largest countries in the world, you don't have time to waste on men who don't measure up. And Catherine didn't take any chances. According to The Poet and the Vampire, the Empress had a friend named Countess Bruce try out anyone she was thinking of having a relationship with. This made a twisted kind of sense. Catherine was so busy, she needed to know that any guy she was going to take to her bed was worth it. So Countess Bruce stepped in to be her official sex tester. The Empress of Art says that she took her role very seriously, sometimes too seriously. At least once, she was found consorting with a tryout well after he was passed on to Catherine. Marie Antoinette is probably one of the most famous queens in history. She was married to Louis XVI and lived an opulent lifestyle, at least until the point where they lost their heads. She had everything handed to her, literally. There were dozens of people following her around handing her things whenever she asked. This apparently got unbearable and she wanted a way to escape. Unfortunately, the way she chose gave the impression that she was ridiculing normal French people. First, she had a personal mini palace built on the grounds of Versailles, but it wasn't enough. She wanted a place where she could really get away, a place that made her feel like a poor person. So she built herself a fake village.
It's not too much, is it?
Modern Nation says this included 11 different cottages, as well as a lake, a watermill, a working dairy, a windmill that didn't mill anything, a barn, and various other peasant-type buildings. Marie Antoinette wasn't just half-assing this. She expected her guests to totally buy into the fantasy of being a poor farmer or whatever. Women were ordered to ditch their fancy gowns for something simple and common. She even brought her kids to learn about farming. Ultimately, her imaginary bonding with the peasant class wasn't enough to save her head, but she thought she tried. When you're Empress of the Romans, you can do pretty much whatever you want, and Valeria Messalina sure did. Her exploits were legendary, literally, as in we don't know for sure if they're true. But according to history's naughty bits, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Elder, and many more all tell the same stories about her. For example, the Empress is said to have owned a house of ill repute where ladies plied their favors for cash and she made a tidy sum out of it. Roman emperors say she even made upper-class ladies participate in the nightly goings-on.
The hell of Messalina! To the health of Messalina!
Valeria Messalina was a champ in the bedroom, according to reports. Supposedly, she frequently won contests about who could bed the most men in a night, sometimes racking up 25 conquests, which is pretty crazy if true. On the other hand, it might just be a story she passed around to keep her husband, the Emperor Claudius, in line. These days, most royal families are more style than substance. There's little chance they could order your head chopped off. Still, Queen Elizabeth II could throw her weight around when she wanted.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister of Canada, for making me feel so old.
The Evening Standard said she had a servant wear her new shoes for a while to break them in for her. Then there were the sandwiches. According to the Daily Beast, when Queen Elizabeth or members of her family ate sandwiches, they'd better not have crusts or corners on them. This bizarre tradition supposedly started over 150 years ago when Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, decided it was bad luck to eat anything that looked even vaguely like a coffin. That meant your square sandwiches had to go. Albert has been dead a long time, but for some reason his sandwich phobia lives on. Joanna, who may not have been as mad as her name suggests, had the misfortune of marrying a hot king. Philip, also known as Philip the Handsome, knew how to control his wife, and he was a jerk about it. According to Mad Monarchs, if he got into an argument with his volatile wife, he'd leave her alone in their bedroom for days. She'd wander around her room banging on the walls, and since she was supposedly argumentative in the general, this happened a lot. It didn't help that Philip was a massive womanizer, even for a king. Once he was dead, however, he belonged only to Joanna, and she seized the moment hard. Time says that once she had her husband's dead body all to herself, she wasn't about to give it up easily. She delayed the burial, and when he was finally interred, she had his coffin opened so she could kiss his feet and make sure his body hadn't been stolen. And even though he was dead, she ordered that women be kept away from him, although it's unclear whether anyone but Joanna was interested in a formerly hot corpse. Like Joanna the Mad of Castile, Maria Eleonora of Sweden may have had serious mental health issues. At the time, she just came across like she was completely bananas. The queen knew it was her job to give birth to a son, but after several miscarriages and stillbirths, when she finally gave birth to a healthy baby, it was a slightly weird-looking baby girl. According to Mad Monarchs, her reaction was, "Instead of a son, I'm given a daughter, dark and ugly, with a great nose and black eyes. Take her from me. I will not have such a monster."
That's not nice.
And oddly, bad things kept happening to the baby. A wooden beam mysteriously fell on the cradle. Another time, she accidentally fell down the stairs. Then there was the time that a nurse dropped her straight onto a stone floor, injuring her shoulder, which remained slightly crooked for the rest of her life. Not even the king could give the poor girl a break. He raised her as a boy, but after her husband died, Maria spent the rest of her life worrying about becoming destitute, while her daughter, Queen Christina, ruled Sweden, crooked shoulder or not. As legendary beauties go, few are as legendary or as beautiful as the mythic Helen of Troy, who became the cause of the Trojan War. But who is this Helen? Was she really worth losing a city over? If you didn't know anything about Helen of Troy, you could probably assume two things from her name. She was called Helen and she was from Troy. Well, only one of those things is true. It would actually be more accurate to call her Helen of Sparta because she was born, raised, and married there. And to be fair, some people do call her that.
Helen? Helen of Sparta?
As the Encyclopedia Britannica explains, she didn't go to Troy until a Trojan prince Paris took her there as his prize for picking Aphrodite as the winner in a beauty contest. In fact, her presumed father was the king of Sparta, Tyndareus, and her first husband was also the king of Sparta. Legend says Tyndareus once forgot to make a sacrifice to Aphrodite, and as a result, she cursed his daughters so they would be doomed to leave their husbands and marry multiple times. That fate applied to his stepdaughter Helen as well as his biological daughters Timandra and Clytemnestra. The latter not only left her husband, but in fact stabbed him to death in the bathtub. Harsh. Tyndareus was only Helen's presumed father because, as was true of so many notable people in Greek myth, her father was actually Zeus. Although Tyndareus raised Helen as his own, he probably suspected something was up because Helen hatched from a giant egg, which is pretty rare for human births. In the most common version of the Helen story, her mother was Leda. If you've seen any art showing a woman getting very cozy with a swan, that's Leda. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, Leda was a princess of Aetolia who married Tyndareus. One day, a swan flew into her arms to escape a pursuing eagle. This swan turned out to be Zeus in disguise, and he used all his avian charms to seduce Leda, and before she knew it, she was laying 2 enormous eggs full of babies. Excellent. While the Athenian hero Theseus is best known for traversing the labyrinth and slaying the Minotaur, the dude had a long life filled with adventures. Some of the wildest of these come as a result of his friendship with Pirithous, which could best be described as an escalating series of dares. According to the mythographer Pseudo-Aphodorus, after killing a bunch of centaurs that got way too drunk at a wedding, Theseus and Pirithous decided it would be cool if they both married daughters of Zeus. Theseus decided to marry Helen, and Pirithous swore to marry Persephone, the literal queen of hell. Both of these goals involved kidnappings, and both were monstrously bad ideas. Theseus took the child Helen from Sparta and left her in the care of his mother, while he and Pirithous went down to the underworld for Persephone. Long story short, the two idiot boy kings got trapped in the underworld for a while in a magical chair. Meanwhile, the semi-gods Castor and Pollux led an invading force against Athens, not only reclaiming their sister Helen, but also taking Theseus' mother back to Sparta with them as a slave for good measure. When Helen was actually old enough to get married, Tyndareus found himself with a pretty serious problem. How do you choose a husband for the most beautiful woman in the world? According to Pseudo-Apollodorus, Tyndareus was rightly worried that showing preference for any one king over the others could lead to literal violence with armies and all. The good news for Tyndareus, though, was that one of the suitors present was Odysseus, the smartest guy in Greece, who knew he didn't stand a chance in this contest and was actually more interested in marrying Penelope. Odysseus suggested a compromise that came to be known as the Oath of Tyndareus. Once Helen's dad made his pick, every king present would swear a blood oath to throw his military might into avenging the chosen one if anything should happen to him. This agreement made Tyndareus choose Menelaus as his son-in-law and heir.
Yeah, whatever, I'll have that one.
Menelaus of Sparta is chosen.
Sweet as a nut, mate!
It was this oath that led to 1,000 ships being launched to get Helen back once Paris made off with her. So if Helen of Troy wasn't from Troy, she definitely at least went there, right? Like, that was the whole point of a 10-year war in which many of the leading lights of Greece and Troy became a feast for crows. Well, maybe not. According to a number of authors, the Helen who went to Troy was actually a hologram made of clouds, while the real Helen was taken to Egypt by Hermes, where she lived out the entirety of the war. In Euripides' play Helen, the Spartan queen receives word her husband Menelaus has drowned while returning from Troy, leaving her open to the advances of the king of Egypt. At that point, however, a stranger washes up on shore who, as luck would have it, turns out to be Menelaus. The two reunite and explain to each other the various hologram-related shenanigans that got them to this point. They then come up with a plan to trick the king of Egypt and escape back to Sparta. This version of events sounds buck wild, but the historian Herodotus claimed he interviewed Egyptian priests who could confirm Helen was definitely there, so who can say really? If you can't trust Herodotus, who can you trust? One thing the various authors of myths couldn't seem to agree on is where Helen's loyalties lay. If she was in fact kidnapped against her will by Paris, it seems clear she would be hoping for the invading Greeks to win the war, so she could return to Menelaus and their daughter. If instead she was in love with Paris, it seems reasonable she would want to stay in high-walled Ilium with her new beau. Each version has its own supporters. In the Greek epic The Odyssey, Homer tells how Helen tried to expose the trick of the Trojan horse by circling it and doing impressions of each of the Greek kings' wives in order to fool them into replying and exposing themselves. It almost worked, but the clever Odysseus figured out what she was doing and made sure everyone inside the horse kept their mouths shut. The Roman author Virgil, however, says Helen remained true to the Greeks. In Book 6 of his epic The Aeneid, the ghost of Deiphobus, a prince of Troy and Helen's third husband after her brother Paris was killed, tells how Helen went out into the city pretending to perform a religious rite just so she could signal the Greeks inside the horse. For whatever reason, neither author wanted to claim Helen for their side. Pretend you're Menelaus. Your wife just ran off with a young hot guy, you ended up in a big war, and all in all, you're pretty steamed about the whole thing. According to various sources, Menelaus raised a sword to his unfaithful wife when storming the conquered Troy.
I want her back.
Well, of course you do. She's a beautiful woman.
I want her back so I can kill her with my own two hands.
At the last minute, though, he decided to be merciful and spared her life. While the tale varies, in arguably the most mainstream version of the story, Helen and Menelaus reconcile and return to Sparta. They live together and die together and are buried together, happily. The geographer Pausanias, however, records a completely different version of events told by the inhabitants of the island of Rhodes. According to him, Helen was driven out of Sparta by Menelaus' sons and made her way to the home of a friend on Rhodes. What Helen didn't know is that this friend blamed her for the death of her husband, who died on the first day of the Trojan War. The Rhodian queen waited until Helen was bathing and then sent out a bunch of her handmaidens dressed up as the Greek revenge demons, the Furies. These maids, apparently wearing fake bat wings, dog masks, and snake wigs, grabbed Helen from the water and strung her up from a tree. Okay, let's back up a little and look at the facts, or at least what the legends tell us the facts are. Helen was a demigod daughter of Zeus married to a legendary king. She also most likely originated as a goddess who got demoted to demigod status as her story got refined over the years. So it's not particularly surprising that Helen of Troy was worshipped in various spots around Greece. One of the major shrines to Helen was shared with her husband Menelaus. According to the University of Warwick, the Menelaon was located just east of Sparta. Though it became regarded as the burial place for the legendary couple, some suggest the shrine was originally dedicated to Helen alone, where she was worshipped as a fertility goddess, only for the Menelaus-related elements to be added later. Pausanias tells how the Rhodians worshipped Helen as a fertility goddess known as Helen of the Trees, with her shrine naturally being the tree where she was hanged. He further says on a temple of the Acropolis of Sparta hang bits of eggshell tied with ribbon, which people believe to be part of the egg from which Helen and her egg siblings were hatched. If you've ever engaged in any type of creative endeavor, you probably felt pressure to recreate the perfect image in your head to do justice to the spirit of the person, place, or theme that inspired you. Imagine then the immense pressure to paint a portrait of the most beautiful woman who ever lived. That was the task facing the legendary Greek painter Zeuxis when he was commissioned to envision Helen of Troy in paint to decorate a temple of Hera. According to the College Art Association's review of a book about him, Zeuxis' reaction to his assignment was to say perfection isn't found in nature, so he would find no single suitable model for Helen of Troy. Instead, he recruited 5 different maidens whose best features he combined into a single figure like some kind of erotic Voltron. The scene of Zeuxis picking his models became a popular artistic motif itself in modern times. In 1604, English playwright Christopher Marlowe penned a line about Helen of Troy more famous than anything Homer ever conceived of. Dr. Faustus sees a demon assuming the form of the legendary beauty and says, quote, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships?" The line has its basis in Lucian of Samosata's satirical Dialogues of the Dead, but it's one of those things that's so entrenched in culture few people know its origin apart from it being a thing you say about Helen of Troy.
Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium?
The line also became the basis of one of the most famous jokes drawn from that commonwealth of comedy, the metric system.
You're a smart mother. That's right. The metric system.
As the back of the Cereal Box blog recounts, the idea of a metric unit of beauty based on Helen of Troy is often attributed to Isaac Asimov, apparently in one of his more whimsical moods, though mathematician W.A.H. Rushton sometimes gets the credit. The idea is if a Helen is the amount of beauty necessary to launch 1,000 ships, then this is a unit that could be broken down in a decimal fashion. Thus, a millihelen would be the amount of beauty necessary to launch 1 ship. Now you have an empirical way to tell your girlfriend she's as pretty as a whole half a Helen. Okay, on second thought, maybe don't do that.
Today we remember Joan of Ark mostly from novels and bad movies. We boil her down to this. Joan of Ark was a rare female military leader, she talked to God, she was burned at the stake, and she looked good in shiny armor. But there's a lot more to Joan of Arc than what you remember from your middle school history textbooks. We call her Joan of Arc today, but that's not what she called herself. For starters, she was French, and Joan isn't a French name. Her given name was actually Joanne, and she called herself Joanne la Pucelle, or Joan the Maid. So the English translation of Joanne is Joan, which is why we English speakers don't refer to her as Joanne. So that makes sense, but what about Arc? Did Joan come from a town called Arc? Nope. According to the St. Joan Center, her father used that name. He was from a place called Arcambois, hence the surname d'Arc. And since modern people have a really hard time fathoming daughters who don't inherit their father's last names, we use Arc as Joan's last name too, even if she never did, having been born in a village called Domremy. Turns out Joan of Domremy just doesn't have that certain je ne sais quoi. In Joan's day, hearing voices meant you were either talking to God or to the devil, and either way it wasn't really great news for you. If you talked to the devil, you were a witch, which meant you'd get burned at the stake. If you talked to God, you were a very important person, which meant that eventually someone would decide you were actually talking to the devil, which meant you'd get burned at the stake. See how that works? Joan grew up devout, so when she started to hear voices, she truly believed she was talking to God, who'd chosen her for a great and noble purpose. But God may not have been behind those voices. According to Live Science, at least 2 modern neurologists have posthumously diagnosed Joan with idiopathic partial epilepsy with auditory features, a genetic form of epilepsy that affects only one part of the brain and can cause auditory hallucinations. Other historians have speculated that Joan suffered from schizophrenia, which would also explain what she assumed was the voice of God. Joan of Arc is often portrayed as the definitive underdog, a peasant girl who became a great military leader and champion for France. That might make a great morale-boosting story to tell around the fire, but it's not quite the whole truth. According to author Ronald Gower, there's evidence that Joan's family was not actually poor. After her death, neighbors testified that her family owned land, specifically 20 acres, including farmland, meadow, and forest. They also had money stashed away for emergencies, which is a lot more than many modern families have. In fact, Joan's family doesn't appear to have been suffering at all. Their annual income was said to be the equivalent of roughly 200 pounds, which was kind of a lot of money in those days, or at least enough to live comfortably. We love to imagine Joan of Arc riding into battle at the head of her army, taking down English soldiers with one arm and praising God with the other. That's probably not exactly how it happened, though, depending on who you ask. Some of the people who knew Joan of Arc claimed she did all that, charged the British with a lance, and fought alongside her men. But not everyone thinks those accounts are accurate. Historian Desmond Seward, who wrote The 100 Years' War, The English in France, said, Joan of Arc merely checked the English advance by reviving Dauphinist morale. Similarly, French historian Edouard Perroy basically said she was just a figurehead. She was content to exhort the combatants, say what advice her voices gave, step into the breach at critical moments, and rally the infantry, which makes sense when you remember Joan of Arc was a heroine, a leader, and an inspirational figure, so it's easy to forget that she was just a child when she accomplished all that she did. According to National Geographic, at the age of 16, she made the journey to Chinon to tell Charles of Valois, the son of the deceased King Charles VI, that God wanted her to help liberate France from its enemies. Unsurprisingly, people needed some convincing. Joan was sent away before meeting Charles, but she returned the following year, still hoping she could reach Charles and make him listen. He did listen, and then he gave her a suit of armor, a sword, and a horse, and sent her off to the front lines. The rest, as they say, is history, literally. When Joan of Arc was captured in 1430, the English charged her with a bunch of seriously lame crimes that we would never dream of charging anyone with today, including witchcraft, heresy, and cross-dressing. Then came a long trial that would have been humiliating except for the part where Joan was so well-spoken and clever that her inquisitors decided to make her public trial a private one because she was making them all look stupid. After that, Joan was forced to sign a document denying that her visions were real and agreeing not to wear men's clothing anymore. Because remember, that last bit was super important. According to Mental Floss, once her life imprisonment sentence was handed down, she went back to wearing men's clothing again. She told interrogators that she did so to better protect herself from harassment from the guards. She also told interrogators she wasn't being totally honest when she said she didn't really hear voices, and though that certainly contributed to her ultimate fate, it seems the cross-dressing was what set everyone off again. So then the bishop in charge decided she was a relapsed heretic, and she was sentenced to death by burning at the stake.